What does choice have to do with our well-being? One time I was mountain biking and I was not in the best shape. The mountains of Lincoln, Nebraska really don't cut it. So as I was going up and down these mountains, I finally, after about 7 miles, I was out. I'd bonked. I sat down and I thought, there's no way I can do anything now. I can't move. I've had it. And then within 10 seconds, I was up and hopping around, jumping around. Why was that? Because I looked down and there was an army of ants racing up my legs like the start of the New York City Marathon. Oftentimes I go through life being motivated by the ants of life instead of by the goodness of life. Apostle Paul writes, "Do you not know that it's God's kindness that's meant to lead you to repentance?" I want that kindness to enable me to make choices in my life, don't you? Enjoy the journey.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Keila Lawrence Jeffrey, and I'm the pastor of the Athens Seventh-day Adventist Church in Athens, Georgia. And I'm joining you tonight and for 7 more evenings to talk about our health. So often when we talk about our health, we focus on one particular aspect, like our exercise or the food we're eating. Those tend to be the main topics when we think about our health. These 8 days, we're going to talk about 8 different areas of our health, looking at it from a more holistic standpoint. And as you tune in every night, whether you're on Facebook Live, whether you're on YouTube, maybe you're even on Twitter, on Periscope, wherever you're tuning in from, I'd love for you to let me know that you're here in the comments. Let me know that you're here and let me know where you're tuning in from. Maybe you're local, that's awesome. Maybe you're from somewhere else, that's awesome too. Together, these 8 days, we want to look holistically at our health and encourage each other on this journey. Now, one of the reasons why I ask you to put in the comments where you're from, your name, where you're from, is because at the end of these 8 days, I'm going to be sharing some prizes. One of those prizes is a magnet, and it reminds you of the commitment to your health that you are making. I'm living creation healthy, right? So there's this magnet that you may receive. Also, in this wonderful little box here is a journal. Maybe you love to write. If you love writing, just jot that in the comments. I'd love to know if there are any other fellow writing lovers out there. So this says Creation Life on the outside, and the inside is full of lined blank pages ready for you to put your thoughts into. And as all good quality journals have, at the back, there's a little pocket. So this is another thing that maybe you'll be getting if you're tuning in every night to these sessions. So be sure that you don't just tune in, but that you jot down in the comments who you are, where you're tuning in from, all that good stuff. One other item. Hi, this is Tyrita tuning in from Athens. Mary Beth tuning in from, are you going to say where you're tuning in from, Mary Beth? Anyway, here's another thing that I would love to share with you. It's a stack of cards, and you'll see this first one says choice because, well, that's the first word from the acronym creation. We are looking at the word creation as a way to look at our health holistically. C, now this is always a spelling test for us all. C stands for choice. R stands for rest. E is for environment. A is for activity. T is for trust, specifically trust in God. I is for interpersonal relationships. O is for outlook. And N is for nutrition. So, just from that word creation, you know that we're looking at our whole health, all these different aspects. And these cards, if you win these cards, these are wonderful and so often adorable if you're into dogs. Um, oh, hi, Jen, tuning in from Marietta. Welcome, Gutenberg. Welcome to you too. Mary Beth's from Portage, Michigan. So there are these different graphics on these pictures, on these cards, I mean. And there's a quote about choice. And I'll read you one here. It says, "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit." And that's from the great Aristotle. So now, then you'll find a couple of cards on creation, then you'll find a couple on rest. I'll read one now. It says, "When he worked, he really worked. But when he played, he really played." And that is from Dr. Zeus. And it goes on. I could go through all of these cards, but I won't. But you may be able to get this stack or one of these stacks. I have a couple of these stacks of cards. And these are essentially pocket tips. These are cards that you can carry with you as a way of reminding yourself of the commitment you have made to better health. Another thing about these 8 days is this: health is not a race, okay? I mean, if you want to talk activity, yes, you may be racing, and that may be part of your activity. Maybe you're training for a marathon. Any runners in the house? Maybe you, yeah, anyway. Health, one thing you'll learn about me is that my mind can just, uh, health is not something that we can just sort of jump into magically to fix, to revamp, to improve. It's a step by step process. And so that's why over these 8 days, we'll be looking at these 8 topics, 8 subjects, and we won't be expecting ourselves to become amazing at each of these right away. What we will expect from ourselves, hopefully you'll expect this from yourself, I'm going to try to expect it from myself, is to develop some realistic uh, ideas, plans for how we want to look at these 8 topics moving forward. If you've registered for tonight, and all you have to do in order to register is actually to go to our website, and I'll try to get a slide of that up in a little while, but if I forget, you just need to go to Athens. Now that I'm trying to say it, I forget it. Athens SDAGA uh, .org, I believe. AthensSDAGA.org, and you'll find a link for 8 days, and that's where you can register. If you registered, you received one of these books, and this is a resource that I believe will help each of us go deeper in our commitment to improving our health. There is a chapter, of course, for each one of the topics that we'll be focusing on, and you'll find them listed here. And at the end of each chapter, uh, the author has wonderfully included some next steps. And we'll look at a couple of those tonight. But those of you who've registered will be talking after this. We'll be meeting at 7:45 on Zoom, and we'll be talking a bit more about what comes in the chapter. So it's not too late for you to register. You can register, and it tells you all the information you need on the website. And I'm happy to put one of these in the mail for you. So even if you get this, maybe you don't get it until Wednesday, Thursday, still it'll be a great resource for you. Well, with all of that said, I want to invite someone to join us now, and I'll tell you a little bit about her. I mean, I could just tell you my own thoughts about her, but then I would go on for a very long time. So I'll tell you a little bit about her. Keila Carmona's passion for ministry is found at the intersection of trauma-informed mental health and discipleship. Keila recently graduated from Andrews University, where she received a master's in social work, as well as a master's of arts in youth and young adult ministry from the Theological Seminary. If there is one thing to remember about Keila, it's that she truly believes that God can make unbelievable transformations in people's lives including yours. And so, without further ado, I'm going to bring on to the, I was going to say stage, bring into the camera here, Keila Carmona. Keila, thank you so very much for joining us this evening. I
Thank you for having me, Michaela.
it's a privilege, truly. Kayla and I worked together for almost 2 years, and it was great stuff. So
Amazing.
we could just sit here and talk about how much we loved working together. But instead of
Right.
doing that, instead of doing that, Kayla, I want to ask you some questions. And for those of you viewing, I want you to know that whenever we have a guest on during these sessions, these guests are not expected to be, experts on the topic. They're speaking from their experience, and that's one thing that I'm excited about related to all of this. And so I'm, yeah, I'm excited to hear from Kayla regarding these questions. So, um, in our book, and the resources that you find on choice that are given to us through the Creation Life materials, there's a quote that says, God has given you the gift of choice. Okay? God has given you the
Mm.
gift of choice. So, Kayla, how do you relate or respond to this statement? Is choice a gift? If so, how so? How have you experienced it as a gift in your own life?
Yeah. So I think it depends on the day, right?
Yeah.
I think there are definitely some days where I'm like, man, God, you love me so much that you gave me this opportunity to decide what happens next. And on other days, I'm just like, God, you could just decide, and that would be okay with me. I
Yes.
would be completely okay. Um, And so in that tension is where I tend to exist most days, right? But I think when we focus on the positive, focus on the, we find like the beauty in what it means to be human, right? Because at our core, we get to decide, hey, how are, who is the person I'm going to decide to be today?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think for me on those good days where I remember that choice is a gift, I become more intentional with how I live, right? I become more intentional about the things that I do, the people who I engage with. Um, when I have that perspective. Now, when I don't have that perspective, it's easy to just live life without intentionality, right? And I think those are the days where I miss out on those small blessings that God wanted to give to me. Um, and so it really depends on the day and what my focus is on.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I see choice a lot of the times for me.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for the honesty. It does depend on the day.
Really does. It really does. Man.
What about this statement from our material? It says, in order to make good decisions, you first have to believe that you have control over your life. How do you respond to that?
Hmm. I agree with it mostly.
Okay.
I mostly agree with that statement. Um, I think where I begin to disagree is knowing it's becoming a little bit more intentional, right? Like what the times when I have the most understanding of what's going on, or when I feel like, man, very empowered, is when I know what in my life I have control over,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so the statement is true, but I think a lot of times when we don't realize the specifics of it, we can make choices, right, that can have a negative impact, right? So going into conversations, I can't control how someone else feels, right? And it's something that we know,
Mm-hmm.
but not a lot of times that we apply to our choice making, right? I can't control my situation, right? In many cases, right? If there's something happening at work, right? If there are layoffs happening at work, that's not a situation I can control,
Mm-hmm.
right? But having a full understanding of, excuse me, what in this moment do I have control over, right? I have control over, in some cases, the influence that I have, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that may change, right? I have control over my actions and my emotions, right? I have control over my perspective, right? I even have control, right, to a degree on how I challenge myself in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so having a full understanding of what exactly it is I can control allows me to make wiser decisions. And so I agree with the overall theme of the statement. We do, right? Like when we understand the depth, right, of in those different areas, right, of like my emotions, my perspective, those things, they sound simple, but they have major impact, right, on the choices that we make.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I understand that, right, I can begin to move more intentionally. And I think that's the whole piece behind this first day of choice is, right, the intentionality that I bring to every decision, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because each decision has impact on something else. And so understanding that allows you to live with more intentionality. Or at least that's what I found for myself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I like how you explain that too, because I I don't know, for those watching, I don't know how many of you spend a lot of time on social media, as I tend to do. Uh, but one of the things that I see a lot of is someone either making a statement or sharing a meme that references the control that we have, but it sounds so kind of self-centered and naive sometimes when it when it's expressed. I'm trying to think of a good example of it. um, but at the end of the day, I think it reflects the fact that we want more control.
Yes.
We would like to have more control. um, where would you say your control ends and God's control begins?
Whew. Um, that is such a good question, right? Um, because it begins to like edge into like theological theodicy questions, right? um, and thankfully, I took a class this school year, so I have like a bit of understanding. But this is always an area that I'm so intrigued by,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where we kind of see this interplay of, and it gets so complex, right? Because on a very basic level, right, I can wake up and decide what I'm going to have for breakfast today,
Right.
right? um but then we can get into the spaces of like the more serious questions of like, well, God, will you stop me if I do something like crazy, if I go to like try to rob a bank? Are you going to stop me from doing that?
Mm-hmm.
um and we, right, biblically, we know that God has the power to do that,
Right.
right? And we look at the story of Nebuchadnezzar, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
right, his whole right, God was just like, nope, I'm taking this, right? This is how it's going to be. Um, and so I think that it's this fine line of, right, there are things that we can control, like the day to day, our choices are up to us. But I also think that God, in His sovereignty, has the ability to step in when He desires to, or when He sees that someone who He cares about, that there's something going on. There's time and time again, right, where God just steps in and He makes, the executive decision of, no, I'm taking this choice away.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think, to directly answer your question, I think that there are moments where God decides to take back over. But I think that's the beauty of choice, is that He decides not to, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even though I have the power to do this,
Yeah.
I'm going to decide not to. So I think that more directly to your question, I think that He always has the ability to step in,
Right.
right? But the beauty of Him giving us the gift of choice is His gift is Him deciding to step back, and
Mm-hmm.
not in a way that is, uncaring or uncompassionate, but love cannot exist without the freedom to choose,
Right.
right? And so from that perspective, I think he always has the ability to, to take that from us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but he decides not to. So I don't know if that answered the question, and I can
Mm-hmm.
unpack it more, but um, and we could go on and on talking about all the intricacies of it, but that's kind of where I am on it so far.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are times when I feel as though um, the simple things in my life have happened because of God. Like
Hmm.
on a, it's a very like woman kind of experience where it's like you've got somewhere to be, you've got to do your hair, you don't know how it's coming together, and then it comes together, and you just feel like God did that,
Yes.
like,
Yes, it was for me.
just for me to,
Yes.
so there are those moments, the everyday moments, where sometimes it feels as though God took control somehow.
Yeah, like he's really looking out, like when you get all the green lights on your way to
Yeah,
work,
yeah,
and you're
yeah,
like,
exactly,
yes.
exactly, exactly. It must have been his hand,
And
you know.
look, it could have been, right? Nothing but him. Nothing but him.
So it's certainly one of these things where in heaven, after all uh, the very important things happen,
Right,
uh,
of course.
and there's so downtime, so to speak. Then we'll be like, okay, God, so let's play back to that moment.
Right. Just between you and I.
Yeah,
Let's talk about what happened.
yeah. And he probably gets a lot of laughs. Yeah. Anyway, how do you, when you think about this gift of choice, how do you go about making choices? Like, how have you found yourself making decisions? Are there what guides you?
Mm.
Is it your mood? Is it the day? Is it a set of values? What is it that helps you make decisions? And I guess or make choices. And you can answer this related to whatever kind of choice comes to your mind, whether you consider it to be uh, like a big choice or a small choice, or whatever. What guides you?
Yeah. Um, so let's look at, like, for me, like the smaller choices, right? I have kind of, for perspective, I have decided in my heart that, like, when I walk past another human being, I'm going to say hello,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and so that choice may not seem like a big choice, right? As far as like where are you going to live, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
what are you going to do for work,
Mm-hmm.
right? But that choice stems from a place of value and experience, right? That is a value that I hold,
Mm-hmm.
right? That each person walking next to me, they are human that God loves, right? And so I should acknowledge that. But how I made that choice stemmed from experience. It stemmed from my conversations with God. And so even in our small decisions, right, me saying hello, right, may not impact, right, world politics, right? But in that moment, that decision, right, because even though I decided in my heart doesn't mean that I actually have to do it,
Right.
right?
Right.
Sometimes there's that difference, but the decision to continue to do that, it stems from, no, this is something that I believe is important,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you mentioned value. So what are the things that are important to me, right? As we're talking about creation and all of these things doing with our well-being, right? Like what are the things that I value, right? And there has to be, it's not enough to be self-aware, right, of what I value,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not enough to say, oh, well, I really value other human beings if the choices I make don't reflect that,
Right.
So the values that I have to influence the decisions that I make.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's the small choices. Now, when it comes to larger choices, right? Right now, for example, I'm in a space of deciding what's next in life. And it has been an interesting journey where there have been moments where I've had choices and moments where I haven't had choices. But a couple of things have stood out to me on this journey that, like, I'm still kind of in. The first thing is the importance of not making a rush decision,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like just because there's something in front of you and just because there's a deadline that you think, right, that there is in your mind doesn't necessarily mean that that is the case,
Right.
right? Like it's okay to either ask for more time if others are involved,
Mm-hmm.
or it's okay to give yourself more time,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, Granted, right, don't procrastinate. That's a whole different other subject, right? But also be willing to sit with it, right? Some choices aren't comfortable choices to make, and it's easy to want to quickly just get it over with.
Yeah.
But I feel that is more dangerous than just sitting with it and
Mm-hmm.
understanding the implications of the choice, who is impacted by this choice,
Mm-hmm.
um, and what are all the things I can gain from it. And so, to that piece, right, a practical thing that I have started doing is making pros and cons lists,
Okay.
right? And it sounds very simple, but it's been so enlightening, right? To really sit down and say, this is what's in front of me. Let's really sit with this. And it's helped me to pause. I think another thing, right? We were talking about control earlier. I think previously in my life, I've been in a place where, well, it's my decision. I can make it by myself, right? And not stop to get wise counsel, right? Um, Understanding that, like, the people who God has placed in my life who are engaging in conversation with Him, He placed them in my life for a reason,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like they're not just there for the moments where we want to have fun or, talk on the phone, right? They're there for the moments where I need prayer, I need someone else's perspective, right? And so I personally call them like my presidential cabinet, right? Like the people who I turn
I
to,
love it. I love it.
right? And it's not a lot of people, but it's the individuals who I know are constantly talking to Jesus, who have a relationship with Him,
Mm-hmm.
and who also will hold me accountable,
Mm-hmm.
right? To you quoted, I think, Aristotle earlier, right, about excellence, right? Like they hold me to that standard.
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, it's like, no, that choice is not going to point you in the direction where you want to go.
Right.
Um, so those are some of the things that I have begun to like learn, not just in the big moments, but in moments that like that are seem mundane,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like seem to not have any value and it's the mundane moments, right? Where like I look down the road and I'm like, man, if I really hadn't made that choice, I would be I would be in a bad situation,
Mm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's the next thing is not underestimating the choices, right, that I make,
Yeah.
right, and seeing them for what they are. So those are some of the things that I've done in my own personal life to make choices that I felt were wise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious for those watching, how do you make choices? Do you do a pros and cons list? Do you have your presidential cabinet? I love that. Do you, do you have a set of values, a set of goals? That I know that's one thing for me. The older I become, and with my being married, having kids, and wanting to make sure that I'm focusing on my family because I intentionally got a family. um, there's some things that I think twice, three, four, five times about. Um, and then there's some things that I know automatically that's not part of my long term trajectory.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, for those of you who are watching, if you don't mind sharing in the chat, how do you make decisions? And as you share and read what each other have shared in the chat, I think it'll be great to see that exchange and to learn from each other too, because not everything works for everyone, right? And not every method works for every situation, right? There's a time and a place for a pros and cons list. There's a time and a place for a values check. There different things work at different times. And then sometimes the choice is real easy. No, you know, So
Yeah.
so yeah, yeah. Well, let's move on here with some more questions for you, Kayla. Okay, so what are things that you have found get in the way of your ability to make decisions that you're pleased with?
Mm. So this is going to sound contradictory to a lot of what I just said, but I think there's a I think there's a balance. So if I'm vulnerable and honest, I think overthinking is one of the things,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think that there is a time and a place for sitting with things,
Yeah.
but there becomes a moment where we cross the line of like genuine reflection into like overthinking and fear,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And when I get into those spaces, I will know that I'm there because I begin to ruminate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not productive anymore, right? I'm not I'm not actually thinking, well, what are the things I can gain from this, or what are the things that would benefit others? I begin to pull up all of the things that could go wrong, right? It's not a
Mm-hmm.
healthy balance of both. Um, and so when I find myself doing that, I say, well, it's time to put this away for the moment and I can come back to it if it's a situation where I can do that.
Yeah.
So that's definitely one of the things that stands in the way of making healthy decisions for myself and healthy choices for myself. Um, I think another thing, and I mentioned this a little bit, um, is the desire to escape,
Mm.
right? There are some really hard choices that we have to make
Yeah.
sometimes. And it's easy, right? Sometimes when we think of escaping, we think of like physically running away. But I find for me, it could be me picking up my phone and playing a game, right? So externally, it looks like I'm just taking a break, right? I'm just taking a moment for self care,
Right. Right.
right?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Right, but internally, right, I know I don't want to deal with this anymore,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
um and right, that can go on to, right, we could talk about why, right, being overwhelmed and all those kind of things, but there are moments where we have to make decisions,
Yeah.
right? And there are some decisions, unfortunately, even if we ask for more time, even if we want more time, we will not have more time,
Yeah.
right? And so escaping takes away from the time that is there,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so overthinking, escaping, um, and then I think one last one is playing too much into my emotions.
Okay.
And so I think, no, I know God has given us emotions and they're helpful
Mm-hmm.
and they're necessary,
Mm-hmm.
but there are also moments where it's like, no, if we logically sat down with this, right, there is a clear answer, right? But just because there is a clear answer doesn't mean that that's the direction I want to go in,
Right. Right.
right?
Yeah.
Like that direction may lead me to be uncomfortable,
Mm-hmm.
right? That direction may require me to have conversations I don't want to have,
Mm-hmm.
right? That are healthy, that are beneficial to me, but I don't necessarily want to do that. And so those three things, right? Overthinking, escaping, and then leaning too heavily onto my emotions and not like logically sitting down. And there's a time and space for both.
Yep.
And I think that is the beauty of choices, like learning in this moment which, right? Not even which, but how are we going to pair the two together?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, so those are the three things that I constantly find myself having to like check myself on,
Mm-hmm.
as I make choices
Mm-hmm.
and healthy choices.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you talked about like pairing the two, the
Yeah.
emotional and the logic, I remember for the longest time, um, I downplayed my ability to make choices because I thought that others in my life were more logical. Therefore, they would be the better
Mm,
ones to make the choice. Because there's that value judgment that's placed there, right? It When we eventually get to the point where we realize that emotions can be very healthy, emotions doesn't automatically equal like melodrama. you know,
right.
when we finally get to that point, it really helps us with our decision making. But for the
Yeah.
longest time, I was just like, I guess I can't be the one to make certain decisions in my life because I just don't have that logical. Others are quicker to be logical. Sometimes this becomes like a man woman, a kind of a conflict, right?
Right.
And women may more heavily depend on men to make decisions, or men may assume that they're the better ones to make the decisions, in that stereotypical way of saying, men are more logical, women are more emotional. And so it's so important. I love the fact that you said, the need to pair the two. There's value in both, and yeah, I hope that for those of you watching this, I hope that if if this is part of your struggle, because you feel as though maybe you're too emotional and you can't trust yourself, um, or maybe you've been blamed for being too logical, you know, consider what Kayla said about pairing the two, and see where that goes. Before we jump to the next question, I just want to share what Tyrita wrote about goals. She said, goals and values are probably priority when making decisions, depending on the decision. I have a couple people I ask because of their different viewpoints. I love that too. Yeah. Sometimes we need to get the different viewpoints. Sometimes we need to hear from somebody else, who we know isn't just going to say what we want them to say.
Exactly.
I mean, there are times with my husband and where, in that stereotypical fashion, he's a fixer, right? So if I bring something to him, he wants to be able to fix it. And not that women can't be fixers, but just speaking in terms of generalization. So there are times when I just want him to be one of my girlfriends.
Right?
you know, I just want to. I didn't ask you to fix it. Just commiserate with me now. Just
Right. Just sit with me in this.
sit with me.
That's it.
But there's value in that other opinion, that other viewpoint. So thank you,
Yeah.
Tyrita, for sharing that with us. A couple more questions here for you, Kayla. What's one of the best choices you've made?
So I was really thinking and processing through this one, and it really hit me and it really struck me. And this was the decision. So about 4 years ago, I moved back to this area to start my graduate program. And when I eventually did start my program, there was a decision I had to make of, are you going to live with your sister and be roommates with your sister, or are you going to move closer to school?
Mm.
So for context, school is about a 40-minute drive in the summer, 45 to an hour in the winter, because you have to be a little bit extra careful up here. Um, and so the decision I made was to live here with her and my amazing, beautiful niece. Um, and that was one of the best decisions I made.
Mm.
One of the best. And it's one that like really struck me. Like when I came and I was processing through it, all of the things that I've gained from it, right? Like our relationship has benefited from it. Like my perspective of her as an individual, right? Because siblings are interesting human beings, right? Like we share DNA, but we also share this like interesting perspective of our families, right? Like right, siblings are interesting. And so becoming adults with your siblings, it puts you in this new space for growing relationship. But there were also moments that I would end up needing her, that I didn't know that I would need her.
Mm.
And there was no one else, right? Like in my community, as much as I love them, there was no one else in my community that could address the situation the way that she specifically could.
Mm.
Um, uh, and then, right, to make it even more amazing, right? I didn't know, and none of us really did know that COVID was coming,
Right.
right? And so, had I decided to move to where my school was, I would have been alone in the middle of a pandemic,
Mm.
right? And even though I'm an introvert, right, like I still need people,
Mm.
right? And so, being able to be in the same space with my sister, and us figuring this thing out together, right? There's another person who gets to contribute to what decisions are made for us to be safe and for us to stay healthy. Um, and so I genuinely looking back on my graduate program, that was one of the best decisions that I made was to live with her. And I didn't know I would be as impacted by that. And it seemed like such a simple decision, but there were so many things that I didn't know was coming for me down the line
Mm-hmm.
that I gained from that one decision. So yeah,
That's yeah, that's incredible. I mean, when you mentioned COVID, it's just like, man, yeah. I mean, for so many people, the isolation became or has been, really, really intense, really tough. And to
right.
think that could have been, where you were. And as a sibling myself, I can only imagine, the thought of no matter how well I may get along with one of my siblings, like, is this
Look,
hurt? Are we gonna be siblings after?
right. What's good? They know all of my buttons and the way to push them to take me right over. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. It's great to hear. It's great to hear that's been one of the best decisions you've made. Does your sister know that? Because you should
No, she doesn't. So
tell
I may tell her.
her.
I
You may. You
may.
may.
We have a really good dynamic right now.
Let's not ruin anything by
Yeah,
sharing
yeah.
all of that. Oh, mercy.
Yeah.
Um. Uh. I. I guess I'm realizing I don't really have any other questions for you. But this has been awesome. It's been awesome to hear your perspective on choice. For those of you watching, if you, um, I would say if you have questions for Keila, but we don't have time for your questions. Sorry, not tonight. But if you do have questions, by all means, share them, and I'll message them to her and share her answers with you tomorrow. Uh, but if you if there is, maybe think of like one thing that you've heard her share that really has resonated with you, and share that in the comments in the chat. That would be really great to see your feedback there. Keila, thank you so very, very much for spending this time with me and with us. And and again, congrats on. Well, I don't think I said this on air, but congrats on your graduation and on these next steps that you'll be making. I know God is blessing, will continue to bless, and you're going to be awesome because that's how you are. So, yeah.
Well,
Thanks.
thanks for having me. This has been so amazing. And I'm so excited for the next 7 days. It's gonna be so much fun.
Awesome. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Keila.
You're welcome.
Well, folks, we have just a couple more minutes, and in those couple of minutes, there's something that I want to share from the workbook because, well, for those of you who don't have it, I want you to be jealous and register so that you can get it. But for whether or not you have it, there's one thing here that I want to share that I thought was quite interesting, which is HALT, HALT. It says, remember HALT. What is HALT? Do not make important decisions when you are hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. Okay? Hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. Do not make decisions during those times. I'm sure you've experienced this where you're hungry, you've gone grocery shopping, and you've come home with things you did not need to buy. So, hunger, anger, loneliness, and fatigue really do negatively impact or can negatively impact our choices. So, that's an easy, quick power tip, as they call them in the book, for each of us today. Well, I want to invite you to invite somebody else to join us, whether or not they register. I want to invite you to invite somebody else. Tomorrow we'll be talking about activity. We're actually not going in order of the word because there's some folks who will be joining us for these conversations that can't come on the exact night that they fall, and that's not a problem. We're flexible here. So tomorrow we'll be talking about activity, and I think I'll actually be interviewing myself. But we're going to be talking about activity tomorrow, and I really, really hope that you will join us for that and invite someone else to do the same. For those of you who have registered, let's join each other now over in Zoom land. And for the rest of you, good night, and may you make amazingly wonderful choices. Take care.